This is American Political Thought for the week of March 22nd through the 26th. This is the second module of our introduction to de Tocqueville. In the first module, I discussed the author's introduction and talked about the nature of Tocquevillian political science and his intentions in writing the book. Starting on the page 3 of the notes, I'd like to then walk us through the overview of Part 1, Volume 1, Part 1, and then we'll see how far we get, but at least I want to get up to the end of Chapter 4. We might actually get through Chapter 5, and Chapter 5 is a long chapter. It describes the beginning of American political institutions, but as you're going to see, it contains a critical framework for de Tocqueville's political science and institutional analysis, the whole framework of decentralization. And in the notes, you'll see on page 5 rather, I actually created a grid which beautifully sums up his doctrine about the nature of centralization and decentralization and where the U.S. fits in and et cetera. So if you're looking at the top of page 3, here's an overview of Volume 1, Part 1. So remember, the point of this first part of the Democracy in America is to introduce the European reader, who was probably unfamiliar with the history of the United States, knew of the existence of the United States, of course, and some aspects of its politics, etc. But since Facebook hadn't been invented yet, they didn't know that much. And so this is like an introduction to America. And in this, again, he lays out some critical aspects of his teaching. And so let's see if we can make sense of this first part of Volume 1. The 8 chapters begin from the most external and non-political features of American existence, the geography. And then in Chapter 2, he begins to talk about the formation of the American people. And he introduces a kind of a technical concept, which he's kind of known as in sociology, and that's the concept of a point of departure. Now, in it, by the way, you'll see that he's talking about the social habits of the Americans, and remember, the regime has not come to existence yet. So, in some ways, this is like it's like Cropsey's understanding of the pre-parchment regime elements of American politics, and I'll explain what he means by the point of departure. But what he's talking about, as you'll see, is essentially the religious and cultural foundations of both the Pilgrim and the Jamestown colonies. And as you'll see, he already has a kind of an ominous forewarning about the impact of slavery, especially on Southern society. So we'll talk about what the point of departure is and what he thinks that the American point of departure is. And you'll see, by the way, one of the things that he thinks is unique about America is most nations in history their origins are actually shrouded in myth and because most ancient nations especially, or even many modern nations, originated before the discipline of history. And de Tocqueville thinks that one interesting thing about America is that almost all the points of America's emergence as a separate regime are visible. They're preserved in historical record, and not only, by the way, of course, because we've already seen with Cropsey and that the Americans tried to encapsulate core aspects of their regime in a parchment form, but literally also because of the discipline of history had developed. And so what's unique about the American point of departure is that it's in almost all of its aspects, it's visible and analyzable by subsequent generations of observers. Chapter 3 turns to what he calls the social state of the, and it's kind of confusing because you'll see in some ways, Chapter 2, the point of departure, is the sociology, the cultural habits, and anthropology of the American people and what gave their distinctive stamp. What he's really talking about in Chapter 3, the social state, as you're going to see, is the economic foundation of American life and character, and it contains. This is a very pungent chapter. Much of what he analyzes about and describes about the unique nature of American society, and especially in Volume 2 when he talks about many aspects of our character and mental and emotional habits and social habits, derive from the insight in Chapter 3 in Part 1. Chapter 4 is the sovereignty of the people, the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people. So you could say, so far, and we'll see, is that geography, or the geographical foundations of American politics, the social or cultural foundations in Chapter 2, the economic foundations in Chapter 3, and you could say Chapter 4 is the doctrinal foundations in the idea of the sovereignty of the people. And I'm going to make an extended commentary about what he means by that and some other key terms in de Tocqueville's analysis. Chapter 5. And so, by the way, to go back just 1 second, you'll see that in Chapter 4, in terms of the elements of a regime that we've talked about from the beginning of the class, as you'll see, de Tocqueville actually, interestingly enough, throughout Democracy in America, doesn't discuss much about the actual document of the Declaration of Independence, but he has an extensive discussion in several parts about the ideas that shape the regime and that Americans share as Americans. And Chapter 4 is one of those core points which lay out the ideational or conceptual layer of the regime. There are other ones, as you'll see in other passages, that do that. With Chapter 5 and through Chapter 8, then de Tocqueville literally introduces the reader to the emergence of distinctive American politics. And Chapter 5, which is the longest of these, and you'll see one of the reasons why it's so long, is because he believes that the interesting thing about American politics is that it developed from the bottom up, from the local level to the national level. And that's true, by the way. Even though it was founded by an imperial or a colonial power, the central power of the crown, American life itself grew up in distinct colonies and localities, which then developed their own habits of self-rule, and then eventually, as the colonies grew, and then by the 1760s, as the conflict with Great Britain grew, then a kind of a national awareness began. And of course, as we've already seen in Articles of Confederation and in the Storing book, by the time that the Revolution broke out, Americans were ready to start structuring their regime on an institutional level, first in the Articles and then the Constitution. So basically, Chapter 5 is the township, county, state. And then Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, de Tocqueville discusses two interesting aspects of the American constitutional order, the judiciary. And you'll see, by the way, that in some ways his interesting thing there, is he quite right about this, is the unique power that Americans gave to their judges through the power of judicial review. The power to use the fundamental Constitution as a statutory standard in the resolution of cases, which he argues, and he's right about this, by the way, it made the American judiciary the most powerful judiciary in the world. And many constitutions in the modern world have imitated this idea of some version of a regular court exercising this unique power of declaring the other acts of the other branches and elements of the political system unconstitutional. That's Chapter 6. And Chapter 7, when he calls political judgment or jurisdiction, actually he's talking about the process of we call impeachment, which existed in the British Crown, in the British Constitution, but he thinks that our colonies and ultimately our states and the Constitution kind of brought this to its peak. And then Chapter 8 concludes the first part of Volume 1, Part 1, with a consideration of the genesis, nature, and emergence and construction and development of the federal Constitution, the Constitution up through, of course, the year that he visited, which would be 1831. So, roughly, the order, why are these 8 chapters in the order that they are? Basically, I would say chapters 1 through 3 are the pre-political or pre-institutional factors. Chapter 4 is the institutional premise or foundational idea, popular sovereignty or rights, etc. And chapters 5 through 8 are the institutional structures of American politics that grow up out of the pre-political factors, such as, again, like geography, culture, and you'll see that means essentially religious and commercial culture, economy in Chapter 3, and then once the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people comes out, That's what actually shapes American political existence, and then that leads to the institutional structures of the regime. So, again, remember, this first part introduces the reader to America. It provides a general historical introduction and is generally organized historically. So let's look more specifically then at the 8 chapters of Volume 1, Part 1. All right, so remember, this is he's in these first 3 chapters, he's raising the question of the pre-political factors that both ground, shape, and notice I put in the notes, determine a nation's politics. Many of these aspects, especially in chapter 2 and 3, belong to the extended part of the regime, the culture, the way of life, the citizen habits. And again, as I said in the first module, introducing the complexities of Tocquevillian political science, the great question for de Tocqueville is how much the legislator can do. Legislator meaning, again, the individual or class of individuals responsible for shaping and directing the politics of a particular society. It's leadership class, and that would include, by the way, both individuals like the founders, who kind of set up the institutional order, but also great statesmen like Lincoln, etc., who in decisive moments give new direction to the regime and steer it into the future. And so a couple of interesting things about chapter 1. De Tocqueville is struck by first of all the grandness, the beauty, the diversity of North America, which possessed almost every kind of imaginable geography available, and so rich in natural resources that in some ways both the size and extent of the American territory, which of course he anticipates. Remember that in 1831. The Union was pretty much only half there and had covered half the continent. But de Tocqueville anticipates that the Anglo-Americans, as he says, will eventually come to establish a continental nation. And so in chapter 1, he's looking at the nature of the geography of the continent. And I have to say, one other thing I want to say about de Tocqueville's manner of writing, he's a political scientist, and if you say political scientist to most undergraduates, their reaction is boring. And if you're taking my Congress class, you know how boring political science can be. Actually, I think political science is pretty interesting. It's the queen of the sciences, according to Aristotle. But the interesting thing about de Tocqueville, as a sociologist in the political sciences, he actually is a beautiful writer. The French is incomparable, and French is a beautiful language when it's literary, and it's hard to get non-literary French, by the way, because it's such a beautiful language. But to give just an example of his power to write and create a scene, I want to direct your attention to page 26 when he's discovering the Europeans discovering Columbus, the tropics. And then we'll come back to the generalizations he makes about North American geography as a basis for American life in a bit. So this is from. So my purpose in reading this is just to remind you that he was a gifted writer and wrote beautifully. When the Europeans landed on the shores of the West Indies and later of South America, they thought themselves transported to the fable lands of the poets. The sea sparkled with the fires of the tropics. For the first time, the extraordinary transparency of the water disclosed the ocean's depths to the navigators. Here and there, little scented islands float like baskets of flowers on the calm sea, except during a hurricane. Everything seemed in those enchanted islands. Everything seen in those enchanted islands seemed devised to meet man's needs or serve his pleasures. Most of the trees were loaded with edible fruits, while those which were least useful to man delighted him by the brilliance of their varied colors. In the groves of fragrant lemon trees, wild figs, round-leafed myrtles, acacias, and oleanders, all interlaced with flowering lianas, a multitude of birds unknown to Europe displayed their bright azure and purple feathers and mingled the concert of their song with the harmony of a world teeming with vivid life. Death lay concealed beneath this brilliant cloak. Now, he's actually saying that the tropics had this kind of ostensible lushness and beauty, but it turned out to be relatively enervating to human energy and civilization. Plus, of course, there's a lot of deadly things in the jungle, like cell towers. North America, he goes on to say, seemed very different. And so what does he learn? He says, first of all, again, the richness of resources, the vastness of the land. And he does talk about the Native Americans as occupying it. And again, and he notes, by the way, there are remnants of great civilizations like the Mayans and the Aztecs, etc. But that most of the native Aboriginal tribes of America were although some were huge, but they were mobile. And in some ways, the specter of North America presented this image of vast natural resources. But he makes 2 points about that. One is that the resources of America required work and development. And his argument is this fostered kind of a American industry. Now, by the way, you could say that's good and bad. I mean, on the one hand, people say, of course, that we expropriated the land from Native Americans, and that we have spoiled it with overdevelopment or something like that. But he does say that's in our blood, and the vast variety and amount of natural resources kind of encourage that. But he does argue, as you'll see, by the way, this penchant for American hard work and industry, he actually argues, is supported by the geography. And it is not supported in other parts of the world where the climate's too hot or intemperate or too cold. Everything in America seemed geographically ready to generate a powerful and extensive nation. And again, he has some interesting comments about the Native Americans and why they were so easily displaced by the European settlers. But I do want to come back to that, because you're going to see in the end of Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 10, the 3 races that inhabit the North American continent. He will have very profound, some sober, some grim things to say about Native Americans, African Americans, and of course European Americans. And by the way, how they have lived together, what they've done to each other and with each other, and what their probably likely future is. And that's where some of, as you're going to see when we come back to the issue of race and slavery, some of de Tocqueville's most profound and sobering and even grim comments are located in Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 10. So Chapter 2, the point of departure. Now, turn to page 31, and let's first of all talk about this technical term that he introduces, the point of departure, on page the opening paragraph on page 31. When a child is born, his first years pass unnoticed in the joys and activities of infancy. As he grows older and begins to become a man, then the doors of the world open and he comes into touch with his fellows. For the first time, notice is taken of him, and people think that they can see the germs of the virtues and vices of his maturity taking shape. That, if I am not mistaken, is a great error. Go back and look at the baby in his mother's arms. See how the outside world is first reflected in the still hazy mirror of his mind. Consider the first examples that strike his attention. Listen to the first words which awaken his dormant powers of thought, and finally take notice of the first struggles he has to endure. Only then will you understand the origins of the prejudices, habits, and passions which are to dominate his life. The whole man is there, if one may put it so, in the cradle. Something analogous happens with nations. This is an almost Freudian concept, that the stamp of your identity comes together not by what school you go to or what college you go to or whom you marry, but the seed and unique aspect of who you are as a human being. It's not so much that it's genetic, but the early environment, he suggests, is like the seed that determines the unfolding. Now, he may or may not be wrong about that, or right about that, about human beings and psychology. But let's make sure you understand how he's translating that into an analytical or a social and political concept. He says there's a point in a nation's history where its unique features are stamped, and they kind of indicate almost all of its potential development. Now, again, one unique thing about America is that point of departure, this concept of an original point where the critical formative elements that will eventually determine the future of the nation are stamped on the origins of society. Again, in most historical nations, that history, that process is obscured in myth or is forgotten or has to be reconstructed. But in America, it's more or less visible from the beginning. So what is that point of departure? It was the fact, of course, that it was a nation of immigrants, and the fact that our parent nation was Britain. And in some ways, the fact that the Protestant Reformation was the immediate conceptual background, and again, the motives for at least the first colonists in the North, I'd say the northern colonists, the Pilgrims. And so, as you're going to see, the immigrants who came to America, they were religious refugees in the North and commercial refugees, if you will, people seeking their fortune in the southern colonies. And interestingly enough, both the Puritan foundations of the North and the commercial foundations of the plantation colonies in the South did both assumed a certain unique flow from Britain. Again, it wasn't the aristocrats who came here and founded either the Puritan colonies in the North. They were religious refugees. And it wasn't the aristocracy who came and founded the southern colonies. They were people hoping to make a buck, because England, like most other aristocratic societies, is a pretty close society. So one of the first things you note is that the American point of departure combines a kind of religious spirituality and commercial orientation. And as you're going to see as the analysis unfolds, he really thinks this is a unique American contribution, that Americans are both one of the most religious peoples, and at the same time they're one of the most avaricious and aspiring commercial peoples. And so much of that, by the way, for the unlocking of the commercial spirit will occur in chapter 3, as you'll see. So what was it then in our English foundations in the Puritan North and the commercial South well, here on page 33. This was the time of religious quarrel shaking Christendom. England plunged vehemently forward in this new career. The English, who had always been staid and deliberate, became austere and argumentative. These intellectual battles greatly advanced education and a more profound culture. Absorption and talk about religion led to chaster morals. So in some ways, you're going to see, what did the Puritans, especially the Puritans in the North, which I think he thinks was probably the more formative element in American character, although you're going to see that he's quite aware of what the nature of the southern colonies was, which were both commercial and added this commercial dimension to the American spirit. But essentially what characteristics uniquely came together was, one, a belief in the essential liberty and equality, for Christian reasons, of course, because the Puritans were an egalitarian community, and also the intensity of communal responsibility. So de Tocqueville thinks that in the foundational religious social elements of our founding, you got this unique American combination of devotion to the community, a communal responsibility, and the idea the individual is free and responsible member of that community and focused on individual freedom and combined with responsibility, which is, by the way, you're going to see, he thinks is a major theme. And this actually, you'll see, kind of harkens back to the Federalist anti-Federalist debate, that in order to have a society of free individuals, they have to experience their freedom together with their responsibility. And he thought that's what the Puritans managed to do. And they were a little austere and everything. But the other thing is they valued education. So again, he's right about this, that the foundational society of America actually had one of the highest rates of literacy, because, again, this was a byproduct of the Protestant Reformation. Catholics weren't supposed to read the Bible. And again, literacy, mass literacy, was a relatively rare concept in human history, partially because of the difficulty of the written languages, but also because only two ancient nations in the West, for instance, expected the masses to be able to read, the Greeks, and even that was pretty small, because of the democratic foundations, but also Judea, Israel, because everyone was expected to be able to read and understand the Torah. But there's no question the Protestant Reformation, because the idea was, of course, salvation occurs by faith, and what generates faith is the Word. And therefore, the individual believer had to freely form his or her bond with the Holy Spirit, primarily through faith, through an exposure to the Word, and therefore, the social expectations of mass literacy was already unleashed. So, the focus on individual liberty, but combined with responsibility, general equality of mores, and a relative lack of classes, although you're going to see the South conditions that to somewhat, and you'll see what institution leads to something like a class society in the South. But then also this religiosity combined with this commercial spirit and the idea of individual acquisition. He will point out repeatedly that Americans are the most materially, and by the way, Europeans always thought this about us, that all Americans love is money. But then Tocqueville was puzzled by these twin elements intertwining in the American character of a remarkable charitableness and sense of Christian spirituality, combined with this worldly desire to have the goods of this life. So that's our point of departure. Let's see that even in this early analysis, he notes there is a difference between the North and the South on page 34. But within this general picture, there were some very pronounced nuances which need to be mentioned. There were two main branches of the great Anglo-American family which have, so far, grown up together without completely mingling, one in the South and the other in the North. And he goes describes the founding of the Jamestown colony in 1607, 1608. It was therefore gold seekers who were sent to Virginia, men without wealth or standards, whose restless, turbulent temper endangered the infant colony and made its progress vacillating. Craftsmen and farm laborers came later. They were quieter folk with better morals, but there's hardly any respect in which they rose above the level of the English lower classes. No noble or thought or conception above gain provided over the foundations of these new settlements. And then on the top of page 35, the colony had hardly been established, as the 1619 project points out, when slavery was introduced. And by the way, look at the footnote on page 35, footnote 4. But anyway, that was the basic fact determined to exert immense influence on the character, laws, and future of the whole South. And here is de Tocqueville's take on slavery on 35. Slavery, as we shall show, dishonors labor. It introduces idleness into society, and therewith ignorance and pride, poverty and luxury. It enervates the powers of the mind and numbs human activity, not just the slave, but the master too. Slavery combined with English character explains the mores and social conditions of the South. As you're going to see, he will come back to this observation about differences between Northern and Southern character in society. Southern character having remnants of aristocracy, because of course slave labor enabled the creation of large plantations which came to resemble some of the aristocratic classes. But then also this, he's going to note in many times throughout the book, this profound difference in attitude towards work. And one of the things he admired most about the Puritan North and eventually the commercial North that emerged is Americans were not ashamed of work. They didn't think work was a shameful thing, any kind of work. They thought there was an inherent dignity to work. Whereas you go south of the Ohio River into the southern states, and work had this kind of shameful, slavish association. And that the aim of society was to enable certain people to transcend that, which deformed both the character of master and slave. So you'll see this is an ominous initial beginning in our point of departure, which suggests that, again, that even though there are some generalizable characteristics to American character and society overall, because of our common English foundations and the common struggle eventually of the Revolution, nevertheless, there are two modes of Americanism, and at the heart of those two modes is the presence of slavery in one of them. So, Chapter 3, the social state of the Anglo-Americans. And you will discover that when you read here, what he really means is the economic foundations of American life. And the most important discussion here that he's introducing is the abolition of primogeniture, which he considers to be the economic foundation of aristocratic society. So look on the bottom of 51. I am surprised that ancient and modern writers have not attributed greater importance to the laws of inheritance and their effect on the progress of human affairs. They are, it is true, civil laws, but they should head the list of all political institutions. And I remember when I first studied in graduate school, I first read de Tocqueville as a junior, as an undergraduate, but then I had an entire graduate course on de Tocqueville, and I wrote a long paper in which I came close to suggesting that there were almost Marxist dimensions to de Tocqueville's thought, in the sense that he gave such a powerful influence to economic institutions. In other words, it wasn't Marx who invented the idea that economic institutions are often the foundation of many other aspects of society. Now, of course, for Marx, it was exclusive, and all other aspects of society flow from the economic arrangements of property and productive property. But you're going to see this critical thing that when the settlers came to America, both North and South, they abolished primogeniture. Now, what primogeniture is, and the laws of inheritance that he's talking about, is that primogeniture means firstborn. The oldest son inherits the totality of property, the title to the property, from the father. It's a patriarchal form of inheritance. But then also noble titles traveled along this way. And so primogeniture and the primacy of the firstborn son is the economic and social foundation of, and I think he's probably right about this, all aristocracy. And the fact that when ownership and laws of owning property were established in America, that this near universal institution that propped up ancient and contemporary aristocracy was absent, was probably the single most influential factor, aside from the social conditions we just examined in Chapter 2, in the emergence of the economic ordering of society. To continue on the bottom of 51 and the top of 52. Moreover, their ways of influence in society is both sure and uniform. In some sense, they lay hands on each generation before it is born. By their means, man is armed with almost supernatural power over the future of his fellows. When the lawgiver has once fixed the law of inheritance, he can rest for centuries. Once the impulse has been given to his handiwork, he can take his hand away. So, what is it that primogeniture does, and the abolition of? And of course, the alternative to the oldest son inheriting both title and property is the estate is distributed among all the children. And you're going to see that what this does is, of course, it breaks up estates and makes property fluid. And as you're going to see, maybe I'll just go ahead and just summarize the rest of the chapter. What it does is it severs the connection between family and land, and therefore throws, as estates get broken up and property becomes fluid, then here's the critical thing he says this has an effect. First of all, families become, instead of these century-old things where people look centuries back and centuries forward, and which has a tendency to take human egoism and attach it to family and land and creates permanent classes, says, no, but when inheritance is broken up among all the children, then property, then again, and that means in the first generation, the property is broken up, and then that's broken up with a subsequent, and therefore the people that inherit the land don't feel that attachment to the land that aristocratic families do, and therefore no permanent class of owners and non-owners is formed. This is really critical for de Tocqueville, and you will discover that not only does he see this kind of proto-capitalism, the free market in property, as making sure that that's why there aren't any permanent classes. Now, you're going to see it's not that there aren't rich and poor. Look on the bottom of page 54. It's not that in the United States as everywhere there are no rich. Indeed, I know no other country where love of money has such a grip on men's hearts, or where stronger scorn is expressed for the theory of permanent equality of property. And Marx always complained, and the socialists always complained, is that socialism and Marxism could get no anchor here because Americans just weren't interested in revolution because they didn't experience the ownership of property as permanent classes that limited. And here's what you're going to see. Here's the psychological thing. Not only does it sever the connection between family and land, and therefore family contracts. Instead of being this grand extended thing as it is in most traditional societies, family becomes the nuclear family and once the connection with land is severed, then family becomes mobile and transportable. So all kinds of critical future characteristics of American character are located in this. Our mobility, our sense of optimism, because here's the point, if there are no permanent classes, this is the defining feature of aristocracy, and you're going to see he makes a lot of this about what he talks about the coming of democracy and the equality of conditions. If there aren't permanent classes, you have to see that what the effect on the human imagination and experience of your life is if there are permanent classes. That means basically that where you are born in society is where you spend the rest of your life. There's no possibility of mobility, of moving up or down. If you're a peasant, you remain a peasant. Of course, the vast majority of human population were peasants, ruled by aristocratic tiny majorities. So if you can't move up or down, there's a kind of an acceptance, a tragic acceptance of the givenness of life. But if property is fluid and changes hands, and that means you can actually acquire property in the same way that you can lose property, then what becomes the main motive of people in that society? It's to acquire property. It unleashes the acquisitive spirit, so it becomes the general formative aspect of almost everybody, rich or poor in society. Moreover, as you're going to see when it comes to analyze the American habits of mentality and outlook, it turns out that this fluidity of property, which then means an ability to change your place in society, means that you don't see your life as a given anymore, and that Americans, as he points out, as you'll see in Volume 2, our optimism, our sense that you can make a difference in life, this all goes back to this fundamental abolition of primogeniture, the fluidity of property, and the fact that fortunes can rise and fall, and that every individual, therefore, saw a certain control over his or her fate. De Tocqueville ascribes a remarkable amount of influence over the eventual emergence of American society and American character to this unique ability of people born into American society not to be condemned by their social and economic conditions for the rest of their life. Not that there aren't inequalities of property, but this fluidity of property is the essential equality of condition that de Tocqueville thinks has shaped the American character and in some ways the modern prospect. And you'll note, by the way, again, that even in this respect, there are some differences between North and South. And I have to say that when I moved to the South the first time and first went to the University of Virginia, which was in Virginia and was kind of right on the brink between I-64, which is federal land. Above that is a suburb of Washington. Charlottesville's right on the border of that, and the real South begins after that. But especially when I lived in the South, there's no question that of all parts of the country, the South was more traditional, more family-oriented, and had more of this sense of family attachment that de Tocqueville sees as descriptive of aristocracy. Now, of course, that's rapidly changing, and the South in 2021 that we live in now is quite different from even the South, for all kinds of reasons, that I moved to in 1986. So, we are up to chapter 4, and this is the sovereignty of the people. First of all, what I do on the notes is I explain, and this is partially related to what I was just talking about with chapter 3. I explain critical terms in de Tocqueville, and I'll just read from the notes, and you'll see this unfolding in this chapter, and also how it dovetails with the point of departure of this belief in religious equality and freedom, and the fluidity of property, and the relative lack of social classes and economic freedom and upward mobility. And each of these four terms are critical to his analysis, as you're going to see, and as the book unfolds, you'll see these terms are used in different ways, and the way I conceive of them is like the facets of a diamond show different aspects of the whole gem, but there is a single gem underneath. That single gem is in some ways democracy, which is the more fundamental term, and as we've seen from the beginning of the book, that's what he thinks the great change in human affairs is. The change from aristocratic society, economy, and politics to democratic politics. So here are four terms that are almost synonymous, but not quite. And again, as I say, the analogy may be to the facets on a diamond. One is equality of conditions. No permanent social classes that we kind of described in Chapter 3. The second one is popular sovereignty. The doctrine that political power comes from the whole of society and the people, and that government is for the benefit of the people. And by the way, de Tocqueville then in Chapter 4 turns to the fount of American politics and society in this concept. Look at the opening line of Chapter 4. Any discussion of the political laws of the United States must always begin with the dogma of the sovereignty of the people. We'll come back to this in a minute. Another term, and that will become more important as the institutional life of America emerges, first in Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 5, and then the institutions of American life. But as you'll see in Volume 1, Part 2, where he actually begins to describe how democracy works as a social and political system. After having set up and described the emergence of American institutions, then he turns in Part 2 to explaining how American democracy really is, first of all, democratic, and what that means, and how, again, democracy works as a system of government and society in America. And the third term, therefore, becomes majority rule. And as you're going to see, this becomes the dominant, not only just the dominant political modus operandi of democracy, but also the dominant social apparatus. Majority rule. If people are equal, then the only way to steer society and government is through a majority, that is to say 50% of equal entities. And Americans, as you're going to see, as do all democratic peoples, have this profound belief in the power, the goodness, and the nature of the majority, which is both a blessing and a curse, as you will see. And then ultimately the architectonic, or the more comprehensive term, democracy. The rule of the people, more or less a summary of all of the above. De Tocqueville considers this an accurate description of American government, and you'll see, by the way, where he really does think, contrary to the Marxists and other people who argue that America is an oligopoly of capitalistic corporate interests, puppet masters diddling America. In Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 1, a short, also like Chapter 4 here, a short chapter, de Tocqueville is going to argue that America really is a democracy. Now, we'll see what he means by that and what his measurement is. It would be accurate to say that these concepts overlap, but as a totality describe what the human world is moving into, first in America, and then France, of course, in a messy way. And what de Tocqueville hopes his book will produce in Europe, throughout, and the world is a gradual movement towards a decent democracy, and we'll see what the alternatives to a decent democracy are. This is what de Tocqueville means when he says that we're moving from aristocracy to democracy. And if you go back to the author's introduction, that point about 700 years ago, when he believes that democracy began to emerge. Now, let me read. So there's some weighty things in this relatively short chapter, and I want to bring them out and tease out the implications and the centrality of the important ideas in this chapter. Let me read a couple of quotes on 58, 59, 59, and 60. I put 59A and 59B and so forth because when I mark passages for reading and teaching, I do it by A, B, C, and so forth if I have multiple persons. So let's read on 58. The principle of the sovereignty of the people, and listen very carefully, I'm going to make quite a bit of this in a minute, which is always to be found more or less at the bottom of all human institutions. This is a very weighty sentence. Usually remains buried there. You're going to see that what he's talking about is 5,000 years of human political history. It is obeyed without being recognized, or if for one moment it is brought into the daylight, it is hastily thrust back into the gloom of the sanctuary. I don't think he accidentally chose those terms there. And he's going to suggest, by the way, that the aristocratic ordering of humanity was both a class phenomenon, where relatively few powerful members of society, but also where this inequality of human rule was blessed by religious belief and superstition. The will of the nation is one of the phrases most generally abused by intriguers and despots of every age. Some have seen the expression of it in the bought votes of a few agents of authority, others in the votes of an interested or frightened minority, and some have even discovered it in a people's silence, thinking that the fact of obedience justified the right to command. But in America, the sovereignty of the people is neither hidden nor sterile, as with some other nations. Mores recognize it, and the laws proclaim it. It spreads with freedom and attains unimpeded its ultimate consequences. And then look on page 59, a couple of quotes I want to bring in front of you, and then again, as I say, I'll lay an interpretive framework on this, and we'll probably end with this discussion of Chapter 4 in this second module. On the top of 59, it could not be ostensibly proclaimed in the laws, as the colonies were still then bound to obey the motherland. It had to therefore lie hidden in the provincial assemblies, especially that of the township. There it spread secretly. So, by the way, note, remember when I tried to describe the emergence of the regime in last week's modules with the different stages of regime analysis? The critical American foundational idea that makes our regime what it is, the notion of rights, but also the sovereignty of the people. Remember, as British colonies, this is what he's saying is, this was kind of introduced by the American point of departure, the Puritans, because, and by the way, he quotes in Chapter 2 from the Mayflower Compact, and the idea that people come together to form government, equal and free individuals, which then becomes, again, secularized in the doctrine of rights by Hobbes, Locke, and the modern philosophers, as we've seen. It was planted in colonial America, but it couldn't really be a regime factor until it could come out in the open, and that's what the revolution did. There was a real revolution where the governing ideas of society really did change. And as he says on page 59, the American Revolution broke out. The dogma of the sovereignty of the people came out of the township and took possession of the government. Every class enlisted in its cause, and the war was fought, and victory obtained in its name. It became the law of the land. So, and then on page 60, in the United States in our day, the principle of the sovereignty of the people has been adopted and practiced in every way that imagination could suggest. It has been detached from all fictions to which it has elsewhere been carefully wrapped, that the will of the people is the will of the king or the pope or the emperor. And by the way, this is in the second paragraph of the Declaration, where the concept of rights is laid out and articulated, but also where the concept of consent, that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is the doctrine that de Tocqueville is calling popular sovereignty. It has been detached from all fictions in which it has elsewhere been carefully wrapped. It takes on every possible form that the exigencies of the case require. Sometimes the body of the people make the laws, as at Athens. Sometimes deputies, elected by universal suffrage, represent it and act in its name under its almost immediate supervisions. So let's tease out the meaning and importance of this chapter and what it's teaching, and what it reveals about de Tocqueville and his own standpoint on this great change from aristocracy to democracy. So de Tocqueville, as I like to say, tips his hand. Popular sovereignty is the truth of the human condition, which means that the vast bulk of humanity's political arrangements in the past have been founded upon a false assumption of human inequality, and that a tiny majority or a priesthood or an incarnate God or something like that had the right to rule the vast majority. But de Tocqueville then, when I say he tips his hands, he admits that any other view of political power is false, which means most of human politics up until that 700 year ago point where the doctrine of equality and the sovereignty of the people began to creep out to the fluidity of social mobility within the church, of all places, the Catholic Church, the most hierarchical version of Christianity. But again, you have to see if you go back and how this. But again, then what he suggests is this idea of equality and popular sovereignty begins to creep out, and then it becomes a force, just like if you stuck your finger in the hole in a dam and then pulled it out, the little leak would become a fountain and then eventually wash away. That's what he argues has led up to 1776 and to 1789. I also think that here this explains the question that we raised in the author's introduction, the historical inevitability of democracy. Not just because it's been around for a long time, or the current that he describes is long-standing, but I think he thinks it's inevitable because once the truth comes out, you can't get the cat back in the bag or the genie back in the bottle. So three questions I think come out of this in terms of his whole enterprise, and in fact, human history and the human future. Can the doctrine of the sovereignty, because it really has now become the universal basis of all political authority. Even the Queen in England in some ways recognizes that she rules by the will of the people. Could humanity regress into mythical and false aristocracy? In some of my science fiction classes, we kind of raise that question because, like in the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov or the Dune series, which they're coming out with another movie version this year, humanity has reimposed aristocracy and royal emperorship on the human race. But that's a question. Could you imagine actually going back to an idea that one class of human beings has the right to rule others by birth, inequality, or divine right? I'm not sure. I think de Tocqueville may be right. Once it's out, it seems to me it has this corrosive power that eventually washes away anything that is different from it. And then, as we're going to see, this leads to a very profound question, one that we'll be asking throughout the rest of the book, and indeed about American life in general and the future of humanity. Is it good for humanity? Now, to say this to a college student already, any human being could say, what a crazy question. Isn't truth always better than falsity? Generally, yes, until you're married. So this, you're going to see, this becomes an urgent question for de Tocqueville as he watches different varieties of democracy emerge, some terrible, by the way, but then also the question he's raising is, does democracy in America suggest that the democratic future of humanity is truer and more just, but perhaps, as you'll see when we get to chapter 6 in part 2 of volume 1, it may be more truer, but perhaps it's uglier. We'll have to explain that. And again, there's a chicken and egg question. Which is the core cause of political life? Is it mores, customs, habits, beliefs, economic arrangements that we've seen up till so, or is it laws, that is to say, deliberate political or legal institution arrangements? Do mores cause laws, or can laws change mores? And you'll see, as I've already suggested in the beginning of this question, the reality is both. But sometimes mores limit the ability of legislators or people to manipulate political morality through legal reform, and sometimes legal reform can in fact change the way people believe and act. By the way, I think desegregation in the South is an example of how social customs both limit but then also can be changed. But this is a great question of political life, and it's at the heart of Tocqueville's analysis. And remember, this is critical to you, the legislators, political leaders of the day. Why? And this is the sober and grim tip-off. As we turn to the institutions of American life in the rest of volume in parts 1 and 2, and volume 2, de Tocqueville will describe why American democracy should be, as it developed to the point that he saw it, the model of democracy for the world because of the unique aspects of American character and citizenship, as you'll see below, and why ultimately American and modern democracy will probably not be able to sustain these elements, and that the institutional developments of American life will eventually undermine and dissolve the very character elements that de Tocqueville thought made the American citizen the envy of the world. And you will see, and we'll end here, that that statement contains a whiff of the old debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And you'll see that in some ways, as we move through to Tocqueville, it's difficult to classify him because he will advocate certain aspects of what is emerged in anti-federal thought and certain aspects of what emerged in federal thought. And he seems to have the point of view which encompasses both of them, as God willing we'll see.